Today's scripture is Genesis 32, 4 through 6. Jacob commanded them, "You are to say to my lord Esau, this is what your servant Jacob says. I have been staying with Laban and have been delayed until now. I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants. I have sent this message to inform my lord in order to seek your favor." When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau. He is coming to meet you, and he has 400 men with him." This is the word of the Lord.
All right, so we've been in a series called Jacob and Sons. How many of you have been with us for any of this Story of God series so far, yeah? So what we did a whole long time ago was I decided, without any counsel, to preach through. See, I say we to deflect some of the blame. You notice how I do that? I decided to preach through as much of the Bible as I possibly could, and this is our, I think, 16th or 17th sermon just in Genesis. So if we don't hurry this thing up, my grandchildren will have to finish it with the book of Revelation here. But we've been in this series looking at the big story of the Bible. And we did a number of weeks on the early stories of Genesis, creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, all the good stuff. And what we found was that God made a good world full of only good things, but that through you and I, human beings with free will, we consistently chose the way of sin, which leads to death. And so God's world was broken and corrupted. And God's response, God's solution to the brokenness of the world is to raise up a blessed people through whom he can bless the world. And this is through a guy named Abram or Abraham. Anybody heard of Abraham before? So Abraham and Sarah, God tells them, through you, I'm going to bless all the families on the earth. And so they have Isaac who marries Rebekah, and then Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob and Esau. And we've been tracking the story of Jacob up until this point. And like I said, you can go back and listen if you've missed some of those messages before. But what we found here is that Jacob, his name means heel, because in the womb he was wrestling with his brother Esau. And even though Esau, his twin, came out first, Jacob came grabbing onto Esau's heel. And so pretty much this is a picture of Jacob's whole personality. You know, you ever take one of those personality profiles, anybody out there, the Myers-Briggs or the DISC or the Enneagram? That's the new hip one, right? Everybody loves the Enneagram. Imagine taking a personality test and it coming back saying you're a heel grabber, right? You're a deceiver. You're always tripping people up to get ahead. You're always trying to supplant somebody who's ahead of you so you can be the guy at the top. You're self-centered. You're ambitious. Nobody wants that personality profile. But Jacob, from the womb, they were like, this is who you are. And so this whole story that we've been preaching through, he steals Esau's birthright. He steals Esau's blessing. And so he goes on the run. And he goes to his uncle Laban's house where he marries multiple women, has all kinds of kids. And we talked about that beautiful dysfunction last week. So check that out if you missed that. All kinds of messed up stuff. Violates every rule for marriage in the Bible. And the whole point that we've been talking about in this series over and over and over again is that the only hero in the Bible is not Jacob, it's not Rachel, it's not Leah, it's not Esau. The only hero in the whole Bible is the God of loyal love who uses messed up people with messed up families to move forward his story with the world. Now, what we're going to pick up today is that Jacob has spent 20 years basically hiding from Esau, who was going to kill him. And now he's on the journey back home with his family. He's got all these kids. And notice here in the passage that James read, Jacob knows that Esau's here. He's on the journey home. And he calls him my lord Esau. That's hilarious because he's been tripping up Esau his whole life. He's trying to butter him up. So he sends Esau some animals, he sends him some gifts, and Jacob's clever here. He doesn't even give all the gifts at once. Jacob sends waves of gifts. He spaces them out a bit. He says, your servant Jacob is coming. And his servants come back and they're like, yeah, Esau's there and he's got 400 men. So Jacob's terrified. And what happens here is that Jacob is at the brink of this river called the Jabbok River. He sends his family across for the night, and he is all by himself on the other side of the river, knowing that the next day he's going to meet Esau for the first time in 20 years. And so here we're going to read what I can only describe to you is one of the craziest stories in the entire Bible. And it's in Genesis 32:24. It says, that night Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have contended with God and with men and have prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face to face in Hebrew. For he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping on his hip. Therefore, to this day, the sons of Israel do not eat the tendon of the hip, which is on the socket of the hip, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the tendon of the hip. I said hip so many times. It's one of those words that if you say it too much, it feels like it's not a real word anymore. But this is, without a doubt, one of the weirdest, craziest, coolest stories in Jacob's life and probably the entire Bible. So to set this up for you a little bit here, Jacob had this wild encounter with God, with this ladder, this stairway reaching to heaven, when he was on his way to Laban's house 20 years before. And at that point, he was alone at night on the run, and God appeared to him. And now it's almost like there's these bookends to Jacob's exile, that on the way back, it's a similar thing. It's the same story. He's alone at night, and God appears to him. But this time, God shows up ready to wrestle. And I'm going to be honest with you. I was reading this week, and I'm like, this story's weird. What is happening? What is going on with this story? And some of you, if you grew up in church, you're like, oh yes, of course. This is the part where God wrestles Jacob. And I'm reading it, I'm like, what is happening here? Right? Like, what is going on? It's bizarre. It's this place of encounter. And what we'll find here is that Jacob's life is changed forever, that his name gets changed to Israel. And if you've ever heard of Israel or the Israelites or the tribes of Israel or Israel in the Middle East today, it comes from this wrestling match. Something happens here which changes Jacob's life and therefore changes the rest of the world. Wild story. There's a key thing here which is important for all of our lives, and I don't want you to miss it. And some of you have heard me say it the last couple of weeks. What we find in our own lives, in our own walk with the Lord, is that more often than not, we encounter God not when everything's going well, not when we're on the mountaintop, not when life is going great and there's plenty of money in the bank and our job is fine and everything's nice and comfortable. What we see in Jacob's life and ours is that it's these moments when we feel like we're alone, when we're anxious, when we're on the run, the night before a big thing is about to happen. Esau's gonna kill me. I'm coming back for the first time in 20 years. And this is how life is. It's these moments of crisis, the moments of chaos, the moments when we can't see a way out, that these are the moments that God reveals himself in power in our lives. And so if you are in a place where you're like, Joey, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, guess what? God might be visiting you tonight. He might be coming to wrestle. I don't know. But he's coming. It explicitly says here, in the verses before, I didn't read it because I was trying to keep the passage a little shorter, that it was at the ford of Jabbok, this Jabbok River. Now, names in the Bible are very crucial, as we're about to find. Jacob's name gets changed. He names the place where it happened, Penuel, face to face. Names mean something. And the word Jabbok in Hebrew means emptying. And this is sort of an interesting thing here, because in one sense, it just is a natural emptying of the river, because the Jabbok River would flow into the Jordan. So it's an emptying place for the Jabbok River. But what we also find is that it's an emptying place in Jacob's life. That what God is doing in this moment is he's taking Jacob, the heel grabber, the deceiver, the one who's always tripping people up to get ahead, and he's emptying the Jacob out of him. He's turning him from Jacob to Israel, and he's rooting out some stuff, and he's pulling out some stuff. And I want to tell you, when God does that in your life, it feels like a wrestling match. But here's the thing that I've found in my years as a pastor. 9 years I've been in pastoral ministry. And here's what I found. Most people will miss out on the will of God for their lives, not because they don't have enough, but because they have too much. Here's what I mean. We come to God with our list of all of our accomplishments, and look at me, and look what I've done, and I have these gifts that should be used, and I need to be in these positions, and I need to have this title, and I need people to recognize this, and I have all my stuff and my business and my hobbies. And the thing is, if God is ever going to use you in your life, you got to have a Jabbok moment with the Lord. You got to have an emptying moment with the Lord, that he's got to root out some stuff. He's got to pull out some stuff. And it's when you and I empty ourselves that then there's space for God to move. John the Baptizer said, he must increase and I must decrease. You know what you need to be used by God? Nothing. I love what Tim Keller says. He says you don't need anything to be used by God. The problem is most of us don't have nothing. We have too much of something that we're holding on to. And you see, there are these emptying moments in life when you and I are usually in a crisis. It's when we're on the run. It's when life doesn't make sense, when we're anxious about tomorrow. And it's in that place that if you'll let him, God is going to empty some stuff out of your life. And it hurts. It hurts because you've been Jacob your whole life. It hurts because you've been Jacob from the womb. But if you'll let him, he'll give you a new identity and a new name. But he can't give you that new name unless you're willing to get rid of the old name. He cannot fill a cup that's already full. And so you and I got to empty some stuff. And you see, Jacob has been on a process of spiritual formation from the time he ran away from home. In fact, I'd propose to you that Jacob's been wrestling his whole life. He was in the womb wrestling with Esau. He wrestles the birthright away from Esau. Wrestles the blessing from his father that was for Esau. Stuff that happens in Jacob's 20 years with Uncle Laban that I don't have time to preach to you because it's already going long enough. He's wrestling with his father-in-law, uncle. It's all weird West Virginia stuff. Don't worry about it. He's wrestling with Laban over and over again, fighting over the sheep and deceiving. He's been wrestling his whole life. And what happens in this moment is Jacob is about to have a wrestling match that changes his life forever. And Jacob's strong. Now we think Esau's the strong one because he's the hairy, wild outdoorsman. And Jacob's the homebody. But here it says they wrestled all night until daybreak. That's a long wrestling match. I don't know if you ever wrestled. Josiah, Nate, we were young. We'd wrestle. We were idiots, right? We're like, what do? We don't know what to do. Let's just wrestle each other. And it was a great time. You want to know what young guys do? It's like, let's just fight something. I don't know. That's my whole childhood right there. All night they wrestled, it says. It's a long wrestling match. So it says here in verse 24, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Now, Jacob is about to find, of course, that it's not a man, but it's the Lord. And he says in the morning, I've seen God face to face. But the writer here is giving us Jacob's perspective, that initially, all he knows is this male attacker comes at him in the night. And this is the best part of this. You know who initiated this wrestling match? The Lord. You see, if you think that God will not make you uncomfortable, you don't know this God. And if you want a God that's just going to make you nice and cozy and comfortable and not put any demand on you, you don't know the God of Jacob, because he shows up ready to brawl. And God started it. He started this one. Wrestled with him until daybreak. So Jacob is strong. We saw last week he did this feat of strength, rolling this giant stone when he saw Rachel for the first time. Jacob's strong, and he wrestles all night. Now, when you read this passage, when you hear this passage, if you're like me, you're reading it like, man, what is God doing? Like, what is he up to? What is happening? Who even wins this wrestling match? Is Jacob winning this thing? Or like, what is happening? So it seems to be, on one sense, it looks like Jacob's winning because, they're fighting till daybreak, and the guy sees that he can't prevail, so he touches the hip. And then even then, he's like, look, man, it's daytime now. Can we get this thing over with? And Jacob's still holding on, like, I'm not going to let you go. So it seems in one sense like Jacob is winning. But on the other hand, of course, at one touch from the Lord, Jacob's socket is dislocated. And you'll find that it's dislocated the rest of his life. There's no chiropractor. Not even Kelly could put that thing back into place. And she could fix just about anything. Dislocated for life. And Jacob says in the morning, I've seen God face to face and my life has been spared. So in one sense, it seems like Jacob wins this thing, but you can tell that there's more going on here, that when you look actually at the story in hindsight, you can see that Jacob walks away a new man, and that means God won this thing. So it says here, verse 25, when the man saw he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of his hip was dislocated while he wrestled. Now, most translations say touched. A few translations say struck. And I was looking into this because his hip is dislocated, and it's like, did God just karate chop this thing or what? What happened? And it turns out that when you read the Hebrew that it was written in, the word that is used there is just the ordinary word for touch. The author didn't use the word for hit or strike or attack. It's just the ordinary word for touch. And what we find here is that as he touches the hip, it's dislocated permanently. Now, I've never wrestled and had that happen, okay? Imagine being Jacob for a minute. You're scared for your life. Unknown guy attacks you in the night. You're wrestling. It seems like it's kind of equally matched. And then he touches your hip and it's out of place. Permanently dislocated. And then still, Jacob is holding on. Jacob is clinging to the guy, even after he can't wrestle anymore. Verse 26. Then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So here's what I think is happening here. And again, this story's wild. It's bizarre. Some of you probably have insights that I don't have. But here's what I think is happening in this story. What you see in verse 26, I pointed to it like it was there. Don't worry about that. Pretend like it's still up there. Okay, there it is. He said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. And he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So what happens at this point, they're wrestling all night. You could tell they're both at this breaking point here. Jacob, now with his hip dislocated, seems to be that he's just holding on to the guy. He's just holding on to the Lord. That he can't even wrestle anymore. It doesn't say they were still wrestling. It says he was just holding on and he wouldn't let go. And here's the thing that I think the author wants us to see. That God through touching of the hip and the long wrestling match, all night they're duking it out, Jacob gets to a point where he has nothing left in him but to hold on to the guy that's attacking him. He's got nothing left but to cling to this divine wrestler that came to him at the emptying place. He can't fight anymore. He's not able to wrestle anymore. All that he can do is hold on and say, I'm not going to let go until you bless me. And here's the thing about this. Jacob has been wrestling, remember, his whole life. He's wrestling in the womb, wrestling with Esau, wrestling with his dad, wrestling with Laban. He's been a wrestler from the womb. He's the heel grabber. He's the tripper-upper. He's the deceiver, the supplanter, the guy who's always trying to get ahead. And here in this wrestling match, he's touched in a way which breaks his ability to wrestle. And you'll see that never again does Jacob wrestle. Jacob's not perfect going forward. He still makes mistakes, but you don't see the heel grabber anymore. Why? Because there was a touch from the Lord that broke that fighting spirit inside of Jacob. And you see, there are some things in your life that it's only a miraculous, supernatural touch from God that will do the trick. I believe in trying to work hard on your own effort to be better, be more disciplined, start working out, get some good sleep, go to therapy, get some counseling, work hard at your job. I believe in doing all of those things. But at some point, it's got to be a touch from the Lord that breaks us out of our old ways, that breaks us out of our old life. Tim at the men's group this past week talked about he was on drugs, on alcohol. Even on his football team, there was a Bible verse that said, we are more than conquerors. And the Bible verse didn't do it for him. He thought it was about football. But there was a moment with God that changed his life. And now it's been, what, Tim, 19 years since you've had a drop of alcohol. 19 years. And I could go around this room, and many of you have story after story after story of the power of God in your life. And it wasn't because it was a dynamic strike or a blow. At one touch from the Lord, everything changes. At one touch of his hands, everything changes. And Jacob here comes to a point where his wrestling days are over, and all he can do is cling to him. All he can do is hold on to the Lord. And he begins to seek a blessing from him. You see, his whole life, he was trying to get the blessing from Esau, from his father, from Laban. And here, Jacob comes to a point where all those illegitimate things that he stole through his own deception, he's now about to get a blessing from the Lord himself. But here's what it says in verse 27, and this is key. Notice God doesn't just bless him. Here's what it says. So he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have contended with God and with men and have prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you asked my name? And he blessed him there. There it is, right there. There's the blessing that Jacob's been chasing his whole life. The one he tried to steal from Esau with the bowl of soup, the one he tried to trick his dad into giving him. Here's the blessing right here. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, I've seen God face to face, and my life has been spared. Now, I was doing a lot of studying this week. There's multiple points in the Bible where God changes somebody's name. Abram to Abraham. We see Jesus rename Simon to Peter. We see these name changes in the Bible. And you see, when people in the ancient world chose names, it wasn't just, hey, this sounds like a cute name that would look good in a Facebook post, right? It isn't just a nice name that, sounds good that we can put on the wall in his or her, baby room. It wasn't just a nice sounding thing. The name was identity. The name was meaning. The name was purpose. And so when Jacob came out of the womb, grabbing the heel, they named him Jacob, heel grabber, deceiver. Now here's the thing about this name change. which is totally different from every other name change. When God is about to change his name and bless him, God asks him first his name. And this is kind of a weird thing if you think about it. Wouldn't God already know Jacob's name? Do you think God showed up and was like, wait a minute, who have I been wrestling with? I'm so sorry, right? My bad. I meant to get the other guy on the other river. Like it doesn't make sense on the surface. And yet what we come to see is that what he's doing is asking Jacob to admit his name, admit his identity, confess who he was, confess who he's been. That you don't see God saying to Abram, hey, before I change your name, who are you again? What's your name again? Hey, Simon, who are you before I change your name to Peter? And what God is doing here, Israel, before you become Israel, I need you to give up the heel grabber. I need you to admit the heel grabber, confess the heel grabber. And as Jacob confesses his old name, confesses his old identity, it's only at that point that God renames him Israel. And you have to see this here because in the world today, we want to add just enough Jesus into our lives so it feels like we're a good person now without it costing too much, without it being too inconvenient, without giving too much of a sacrifice. And you see, this is what Jabbok is all about. This is what the emptying is all about. That before you can become Israel, you've got to admit that you've been Jacob. You've got to admit that you've been the heel grabber, that you've been the deceiver. And that's how this match ends. Jacob's holding on. He's clinging. He's like, look, it's daybreak. And he's like, bless me. And God does not give him the blessing until he admits his name. Until admits that he's been Jacob. And it's at that point of confession that God renames him Israel. And Israel kind of has this double meaning to it. It means that he fights or prevails with God. And here's the double meaning here. If I say, I fight with Nate, that can mean one of two things. It can mean we are fighting each other, or if I fight with Nate, we are fighting together against a common enemy, right? Double meaning. And Israel seems to have this double meaning here. That up until Jacob's life, he's been a wrestler. He's been a fighter. He's been scrappy, trying to get his own blessing, tripping people up, deceiving people. And you see, what this story reveals to us is that the real enemy Jacob has been wrestling with his whole life is the Lord. He's been wrestling with God's plan for his life, God's blessing coming to his life, and he's been trying to do it in his own way, on his own terms. He's been Jacob, the fighter, the wrestler. He's been wrestling with God. And so here, Jacob's whole life has been defined by one side of that coin, the one who fights with God, wrestles with God. But from here on out, the second meaning of that name is going to begin to take the lead. That he's going to begin to fight with God, for his plan, for his purpose, for his blessing in the world. And so Israel means the one who fights, prevails, conquers, rules with God. And this is who Jacob becomes. This is who he becomes. The one who rules with God. The one who brings about God's plan for the world. The blessing of God is birthed into the world through this messed up guy with his messed up family. His kids become 12 families who become 12 tribes who become the kingdom of Israel. And they birth the plan of God into the world. Jesus of Nazareth, descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And through him, all the blessings to these forefathers comes to pass. But there's one final thing here I want you to see as we close. It says in verse 31 that as the sun rose upon him, just as he crossed over Penuel, he was limping on his hip. Hebrews 11:21 says this, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and he worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. Jacob limped the rest of his life. He didn't walk the same anymore. He didn't carry himself the same anymore. And those days of wrestling against God became wrestling for God. Jacob to Israel. It was a limp. Changed the way he walked. And the cool thing about that is nobody who ever saw Jacob could see him the same way again. In fact, when he said his name, he couldn't even say who he was without telling a story of how God did something in his life. And you see the difference between somebody who's just a good, nice, religious person who wants to do the right things and show up at church and give their tithe and serve a little bit here and there. The difference between that person and the person who has truly met God is that the person who really met with God walks with a limp. Robert Alter is a Jewish scholar. In his commentary on this passage, he said this: a powerful physical metaphor is intimated by the story of wrestling. Jacob, whose name can be construed as he who acts crookedly, is bent, permanently lamed by his nameless adversary in order to be made straight before his reunion with Esau. Look at this here. To be put right, to be put straight in his heart, in his mind, in his life, in his walk with God. To be put straight, he had to be bent. He had to be broken. He had to be wounded. He had to be dislocated. He had to be emptied. And this is a profound spiritual principle that if you and I are going to become the people that God wants us to be, you have to have this moment with the Lord. You have to have a moment where you let him break you. And if you've never been through this before, it feels like a wrestling match. To be made right, you have to let him break you. And this lines up with what Jesus says in the Gospels, that if you want to find your life, you have to lose it. If you want to gain your life, you've got to give it away. If you want to experience his resurrection, you've got to take up a cross and die. And that doesn't make sense to anybody. But you see what God is doing in those moments is he's crucifying the Jacob that's inside of all of us. He's crucifying the old life, the old way, the self-centered one, the ambitious one, the heel-grabbing one. And on the cross, God puts to death the Jacob inside of us so that Israel can be born. He puts to death the old life and the old way so that God's new life can be raised up out of the inside of us. You can tell who's had an encounter with God because you don't walk the same anymore. The night that Kelly got baptized in the Holy Spirit in our youth center, the power went out. All of our fancy lights, our fog machines didn't work. And we thought, man, I don't know if God can move in this. Power goes out. Someone's up there with an acoustic guitar. Kelly got touched by the Lord so powerfully. She's baptized in the Holy Spirit. Physically couldn't walk. Her dad carried her to the car while she's still speaking in tongues, can't stop. Puts her in bed that night, tucks her in. She's still speaking in tongues. Fell asleep that way. You don't get up the same after that. Paul Washer tells a story. He said, if I walked in this room today and I said, hey, on the way here, I got hit by a semi-truck. I was on the freeway, something happened with my tire, I pulled off to the shoulder, I got out of my car, and a semi hit me. He said, how many of you would believe me? None of you. Because if a semi hits you, you're not just going to walk on in here like nothing happened. And I want to tell you, if you have an encounter with the living God, the real God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you won't walk the same after that. You'll have a little bit of a limp in your step. But I want you to know that when you're weak, He'll be strong. When you're dead, His life will come through you. That's what this limp is all about. You see, you and I, especially in the American church, we want to be strong. We want to be put together. We want to be successful. But Paul said, I have been crucified with Christ. In the life that I now live in the flesh, I don't live by my own faith, but in the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. You see, in the natural world, maturity, growth, strength comes by being independent. I have a 2-year-old. He's doing more and more stuff on his own. He doesn't want me to do anything, actually. He tried to drive the car yesterday. He thinks he's ready. No, I do it all myself. That's what he says all the time. And it drives me nuts. But the truth is, I'm proud of him. Right? He's learning to do things on his own. Trying to potty train him. Now he's running around, he just rips his diaper off and runs naked through the house. He's never been happier than when he's naked. It's wild. Try having toddlers. You see, growth in the natural world is about becoming more independent. But with God, it's the opposite. With God, it's about learning how to walk with a limp, because when you and I are weak, then He is strong. And growth with God doesn't look like becoming more independent, more self-sufficient. It's about decreasing. It's about humbling. It's about lowering yourself. It's about embracing the weakness in your life, because it's in that space that God begins to move. Embrace the weakness. Embrace the humility. That you find someone who has a real history with God. You won't find a super wrestler. You won't find a superhero. You find someone who's really strong in the Lord, you'll find that it's actually someone who walks with a limp. Who's learned to make Him their strength. That when you and I take up that cross and die, that's when His resurrection life is birthed within us.